I'm Dr. Christy, and this is Climbing Fish Parenting, practical parenting strategies in 20 minutes or less. I'm a psychologist and behavior analyst, and I work with exhausted, overwhelmed parents who feel like they've tried everything and nothing works. If you're listening to this while folding the laundry, hiding in your car, or wishing bedtime would just end already, you're in the right place. Today, we're talking about something almost every parent of a tween or teen has lived through. You make a completely reasonable request, and what comes back at you is so much bigger than what you asked for that you're left standing there thinking, wait, what just happened? By the end of this episode, you're going to understand why that gap exists and why it has almost nothing to do with the actual thing you asked for. Ready to transform your parenting journey? Let's dive in. A mom wrote in to ask advice about her 16-year-old daughter. She described her as a smart kid, funny, the kind of teenager who can debate you into the ground about something she actually cares about. She just started driving herself places this year. Her own routes, her own timing, her own judgment calls. This mom wasn't asking for much. She didn't have a tracking app, no check-ins every hour, just one thing. When you get where you're going, send me a text. One word, here. That's it. Takes 4 seconds. Her daughter lost it. Not annoyed lost it. Not eye roll lost it. Full escalation. You don't trust me at all. Then, almost immediately, something her mom didn't see coming. You don't even like spending time with me. And then the one that actually stopped her mom in her tracks. I don't know why you don't want to be close to me like my friend and her mom. Over a request for a text message for one word and 4 seconds of her time. This mom told me, and I want you to sit with this phrasing for a second because I think it's exactly right. I felt like I just asked her to check in. And she heard me saying I didn't trust her with her own life. That's the part I want you to notice. The size of what came back had almost nothing to do with the size of what went in. A 4-second text request turned into a conversation about whether they'll ever have a good relationship. And here's the thing. Mom said this isn't a one-time blow-up with this kid. Mom says we're leaving in 5 minutes, and it turns into a full meltdown about how nobody understands what their life is like. I want you to think for a second about your own version of this. Maybe it's not a text message. Maybe it's, can you put your dishes in the sink? Turning into, you always pick on me and nobody else in this house. Maybe it's denying an extra 30 minutes past curfew on a Friday night, and all reasoning is lost. There's no, can we negotiate? It's straight to, you don't trust them. You clearly don't even want your child to have a life. Same leap, different clothes. Showing up again and again, no matter what the actual ask is. The content changes every time. The shape never does. Something small goes in, something enormous comes out. If you've lived a version of this, you know just how exhausting and mind-boggling these scenarios feel. Here's what I want you to hear first. This is not your kid being manipulative. It's not them trying to control you or punish you for a reasonable request or weaponize a relationship to get their way. I know it can feel that way in the moment. The words they're using are aimed right at the most vulnerable parts of you as a parent. But that's not what's actually happening underneath it. It's also not a sign that you've done something wrong. It's not evidence that your kid doesn't trust you or that the relationship is actually in trouble. Or that you need to rethink the rule. The rule was fine. The relationship is fine. Something else entirely is happening here. And it has almost nothing to do with either of those things. Let's dig into it. Your teenager's brain has 2 systems that matter enormously here. And they're not developing at the same speed, or even on the same kind of timeline. The first is the brain's reward system, specifically a circuit that runs dopamine from deep in the brain out to areas involved in motivation, pleasure, and the pull toward anything that feels exciting, novel, rewarding. Around the start of puberty, this system gets a real measurable surge in dopamine activity. Researchers have found this isn't subtle. Adolescents are even measurably more sensitive to simple things like sweet taste than adults are, which gives you a sense of just how broadly this system gets dialed up. This surge doesn't just happen and then stay flat. It rises, peaks and then comes back down. Researchers describe it as an upside-down U. Self-reported reward-seeking and sensation-seeking research consistently finds this peak landing somewhere in the middle of adolescence. Many studies put it right around 14 to 18, depending on exactly what's being measured. Not 11, not 22. Right in the thick of the teenage years. So if you've ever wondered why your 17-year-old isn't noticeably calmer than they were at 13, here's a real piece of the answer. The system driving big, intense pulls toward excitement, risk, and emotional highs and lows isn't declining yet at 17. For a lot of teenagers, it's close to its peak. The second system is the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that does the braking. It evaluates. It puts things in proportion. It's the part that would normally say, this is a 4-second text, not a referendum on our relationship, when it's working the way it eventually will. Here's the mismatch. The reward system's curve goes up, peaks, and comes back down. The prefrontal cortex development doesn't move in a curve at all. It's a long, slow, steady climb, driven by an actual physical process where unused neural connections get pruned away and the connections that remain get insulated so that they can send signals faster and more reliably. That process runs in a straight line from childhood all the way into the mid-20s. No peak, no dip. Just a long climb that takes a couple of decades to finish. So picture those two lines together. One system rises fast and peaks somewhere in the middle of the teen years. The other system is still climbing steadily the entire time, nowhere near finished, and won't be until the mid-20s. That overlap matters. While that pull toward intensity and excitement is still turned up high, the braking system still has years of work left to do. That's not a brief mismatch at the very start of puberty. It's a long stretch, running through most of the teen years, where one system is running at or near full intensity, while the other one is still under construction. That's why a 16-year-old can still have reactions this big. They're likely at or near the peak of the system that pulls toward intensity and reward. And their brakes, while further along than they were at 13, are nowhere near done. So when your kid heard, "Send me a text when you get there," the part of their brain that responds to anything that feels like a loss of independence or a threat to their autonomy is operating at close to its most intense setting of their entire life. And the part of their brain that would normally step in and say, "Wait, this is actually small," is still years away from being fully built. The size of the reaction you saw was real. It just wasn't actually about the text. Here's what I see clinically on top of all of this. And I want to be clear, this is my observation from years of working with families, not a research finding. These same years, when the reward system is running hot and the brakes are still under construction, they also tend to be loaded with the most identity-level stakes your child has faced yet. Driving, real decisions about the future, the growing awareness that friendships you've had for years might not make it past graduation, questions about who you even are, underneath everything you've always assumed about yourself. None of that is causing the brain mismatch, but I think it's pouring gasoline on it. A nervous system that's already running hot, with brakes that aren't finished, meeting a stretch of years loaded with the highest stakes questions your child has faced yet. That combination is rough. It's not one thing. It's the timing of several things landing all at once. Now, here's the part that matters most for parents of kids wired differently, because everything I just described is true for typical teen brain development. For ADHD and autistic teens specifically, the research shows the emotional side of this gets more complicated. In ADHD, emotional outbursts and low frustration tolerance are now recognized as a core common feature, not a side effect, not bad behavior layered on top of the attention piece, but part of the actual profile for a lot of kids. Brain imaging research has found real differences in how the amygdala connects to the rest of the brain in ADHD, and researchers are still working out exactly what those differences look like. A couple of the leading possibilities are worth naming, even though neither one is fully settled yet. One is that the connection itself is less stable. Picture a phone line that isn't dead, just unreliable. Sometimes the call comes through clearly. Sometimes they're static. Sometimes it drops mid-sentence for no obvious reason. Some studies have found exactly that kind of instability in how the amygdala communicates with the rest of the brain in kids with ADHD. Not a connection that's simply broken or simply too strong, but one that doesn't hold steady the way it does in a typical brain. The other possibility researchers are looking at involves which specific neighboring regions the amygdala is wired to most strongly. Different studies have found different patterns here, and it seems to be tied specifically to how much emotional volatility a particular child shows, rather than to ADHD as a whole. Neither of these is the final answer yet, but the consistent thread across this research is that the wiring involved in reining in a strong emotional reaction doesn't operate the same way it does in a typical brain, and that it shows up as real chronic difficulty with irritability and temper that's separate from, and on top of, the universal teen mismatch we just talked about. So an ADHD teen isn't just living with the universal teen mismatch. There is an additional layer of difficulty reining in big reactions once they start, on top of everything every teenager is already dealing with. In autistic teens, brain imaging research points to something more specific happening in that same amygdala to prefrontal cortex connection. Several studies have found reduced connectivity between the amygdala and the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. That's the specific region involved in dialing emotional reactions back down. The line between the alarm system and the part of the brain that's supposed to calm it down is weaker. One study describes it as a lack of downregulation in the amygdala during tasks that require active emotion regulation, meaning even when the prefrontal cortex is trying to engage, the signal telling the amygdala to settle isn't getting through as effectively. That weaker connection shows up behaviorally in a pattern a lot of parents in this community will recognize. One recent study comparing autistic adolescents to their peers found elevated verbal anger expression and heightened reactivity specifically to frustration and criticism, while physical aggression actually tended to be lower than you might expect. In other words, the explosion is often real, loud, and verbal. The words can come out fast and big, even when it never becomes physical. That's a distinct pattern, not just autism plus anger. It's frustration and criticism specifically that seem to hit hardest, and a weaker connection between the alarm and the brakes is a big part of why. So the same developmental gap every teenager experiences is, for a lot of the kids in this community, both wired and shaped differently depending on how their brain is wired. That's not a flaw. It's not your parenting. It's not your kid being dramatic on purpose. It's a brain doing exactly what brains at this stage of development do, just doing it on a different and sometimes more amplified timeline than the one you were hoping for. So once you see this, the obvious next question is, what do I actually do when it's happening right now in front of me? Here's the one thing I want you to hold on to in the heat of it. Trying to remember a whole strategy while your kid is mid-explosion is kind of unrealistic, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Don't argue with the size of the reaction. That's it. That's the move. Your instinct is going to be to say, this isn't a big deal. Resist that instinct. From the inside of their brain in the moment, it genuinely is that big of a deal. Arguing about proportionality while they're flooded just adds a second fight on top of the first one. And it's a fight you can't win, because you'd be asking a brain that's currently run by its alarm system to access the exact part that isn't online yet. Everything else, how you respond, what to say, what you do afterward, we're getting to. But if you do nothing else today, do that. Here's the second part, the repair conversation. This is where the real work happens, because it happens when both of you have a working prefrontal cortex again. Start by validating without caving. This is different from agreeing. It sounds something like, that felt really big to you. I can see how frustrated you were. You're not saying the reaction was proportionate. You're saying their experience of it was real. That distinction between validating the feeling and agreeing with the conclusion is what actually calms the nervous system down instead of escalating it further. Then separate the request from the meaning they attach to it. Something like, I hear that the text felt like I don't trust you. That's not what I meant by it. And I want to talk about that separately, but I still need the check-in. You're not abandoning the boundary. You're declining to fight about a meaning you never intended. Validate. Explain. Hold the line. Not validate and then quietly fold. And then name the gap itself, out loud, as information rather than a lecture. Something like, I noticed that when I asked for a check-in text, it turned into something about whether I trust you at all. I don't think that's really about the text. I think there's something underneath it about wanting more independence. Can we talk about that directly? That does two things. It gives your kid language for what just happened inside. Most teenagers have no idea their amygdala hijacked a 4-second request. Naming it gently builds a self-awareness that eventually lets them catch it themselves sooner on their own. And it tells them you're not confused or rejecting them. You were actually paying close enough attention to know the explosion wasn't really about the thing it looked like it was about. One more piece. And it matters more than it sounds like it should. Explain your reasoning, even when you don't technically have to. I ask for the text because I love you and want to know you're safe, not because I think you're going to do something wrong. Lands very differently than silence. We're then relitigating the original rule from scratch. I know. This might sound like a contradiction to my advice for a lot of rules and a lot of strategies with kids. Teenagers are learning to bridge the gap between childhood and adulthood, and many adults don't follow rules without understanding why they're there. Teenagers who get an explanation, even one they don't love, build frustration tolerance faster than teenagers who just get a rule with no reasoning behind it. This week, think of one small reasonable request that reliably gets a reaction way out of proportion in your house. Not the biggest battle you're fighting right now. A smaller one, the phone away at the dinner thing, the shoes by the door thing, the check-in text. Next time it happens, just hold the one in the moment move. Don't argue the size of the reaction. Then, later, when things are calm, try naming the gap out loud, not as a lecture, as information. That single shift from, why is she being so dramatic, to what is this actually about, is where everything starts to change. And I'll tell you honestly, this is one piece of a much bigger picture about how wired differently brains experience and express emotion. There's a lot more underneath it that I think is going to change how you read your kid completely. I'm putting together something on exactly that, and I'll have more for you on it soon. Keep an eye out. All right, that's it for today. Your teenager is not overreacting to spite you. They're not being dramatic for the sake of it. Their alarm system got bigger and louder this year, courtesy of the same hormones driving everything else about puberty. And their brakes are still years from catching up. For a lot of our kids, that gap runs hotter or shows up louder, depending on how their brain is wired. If this episode named something you've been living with, hit the share button and send it to another parent who needs to hear that the size of the reaction isn't the size of the actual problem. And if you've never taken my quiz to find out your child's specific profile, what's actually driving their behavior, and what that means for how you support them, go find it at climbingfishparenting.com/quiz. It takes about 2 minutes, and it'll give you language for exactly the kind of thing we talked about today. That strategy I just gave you, it's the whole climbing fish philosophy in action. There's a quote, everybody's a genius. But if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing it's stupid. Your kid isn't broken. Your parenting isn't broken. Sometimes we're just asking our fish to climb trees. That's what we fix here. I'm Dr. Christy, and I'll see you next week.